Ne yapalım Özgür. İngilizce mi konuşalım? Öyle mi? Peki. Evet. Efendim.
So I'd like to welcome you all, first of all. Now we're just starting our parallel sessions, and I've prepared very tough questions for our analysts. Be ready. I actually have two questions, two main questions. One of them is, as we'll be discussing about global energy trends and wind power's role, that is the heading of the title, my first question will be, now there is a decrease in the oil prices right now, and especially in the short, in the medium, and in the long run, how do you think the wind power sector will be affected from the decrease in the oil prices? This is number one question. I mean, oil and natural gas prices, you know, and at the same time, also with wind power, there is a correlation, maybe not 100% correlation, but still there is a correlation. So what will be the effect in the short, medium, long run? My second question is that, as I have also been a professor, after 15 to 20 years, where do you think the wind power industry will be? At which position? I mean, what is your vision, and where do you think the wind power industry will be in 15, 20 years ahead? What kind of a technology and what kind of a wind power technology that you vision? I even will ask you what is going to happen after 50 years, but it will be very hypothetical. So let's just restrict it to 15 to 20 years. So I would like to start the session and continue in that manner. But of course, meanwhile, if there are also some questions, I mean, if there are some hot questions, please write it down on a piece of paper and give it to me. And I also will ask our panelists this question. Don't worry about that. So let's first start with the oil prices, the decrease in the oil prices, its effect on wind power. So, well, let's start with Steve Sawyer first. And the Secretary General of the Global Wind Energy Council. He knows very well about the industry. So let's give the very first floor to you, sir. If it's okay for you, then to follow.
Yeah, we're doing presentations, yes? Or
You wanna do presentation?
well, I was told to prepare a presentation, and I keyed up on the thing there. So.
Okay, just then. Why don't you peki bu iki soru bir
Maybe if you quickly answer my questions, because I really wonder a lot. Because, you know, the oil prices, let's just with the first question, the decrease in the oil prices, its effect on wind power. Just answer that question, then your presentation.
I mean, I think in the short term, there's very little effect, because we don't, in fact, compete directly with oil except in a very few markets. And the price of gas is much less directly connected to the price of oil than it was 10 years ago. In a place like Mexico, where there's still substantial oil generation, there is some competition, but with the energy reform there, wind will end up being much cheaper anyway. In the medium term, it's hard to say. I think to the extent, I think not on wind directly, but on the, perhaps in the shift of the transport sector away from fossil fuels. There could be less of an incentive at $50 a barrel oil than $100 a barrel oil. And obviously transport, the increasing electrification of the energy system and the increasing use of electricity in transport and heat could be hampered by low oil prices, but we'll deal with that down the road. The only thing we know about the future of oil prices is that they'll be different than they are now.
Evet, o zaman Ömer.
Ömer, let's continue with you. Ömer Faruk is actually, he looks very young actually, but don't be mistaken. He's an academician at the same time, and he has his PhD from the Harvard University. Just answer that question, and then for those who would like to deliver a presentation, I'll give the floor. Thank you very much. I don't know if people can hear me. Thank you. Well, the shortest answer to your question is that, BP and the British Petroleum is one of the major producers of the fossil fuels in the world. According to their calculations, 56 years is the life cycle for the fossil fuels. After 56 years, there will no more be fossil fuels. And the same discourse does not applicable for wind. Therefore, I think this is the clear-cut answer to your question, I would say. I mean, wind will never end. So, I guess the structure that you will build upon it, I'm speaking about the legislation, the process, and also technologically, I think we can work harder on it. But for oil, I cannot say the very same thing. How about the investments? Do you think the investments will be more? Let's assume there's a reduction in natural gas prices. And do you think there will be a decrease in investments on the wind power? Yes, of course, I will expect something like this, but the raw material is actually, if, for example, you have a facility and you have a control over the wind or the raw material, then you can also control the supply and the demand. But in wind, you don't have this chance. You do not have the control over the raw material. So, rather than considering this as a disadvantage, I think what is important is to turn it into an advantage. The more the wind power is made more global, I'm sure that will increase the capacity factor. And once we did that, and the energy that is generated from controllable raw material, this is the main rule in business, I should say. So we actually will have more control over this. So commercially, it will be advantageous in the market, I would say. Erol Demirer, I think everyone knows him. Especially, he is the person who actually first introduced the wind power in Turkey, and a very prominent individual. I think during those times, the natural gas conversion power plants were very common, popular, but you invested on wind power. So what do you think on this? Well, of course, when the natural gas investment costs are lower, of course there will be, when the natural gas actual prices reduce, then the investments will be reduced. So if I have the fear of the natural gas, I would never start wind. Wind is like the fish on the sea. The more that you catch, it is replaced with the new fishes. However, natural gas is just like a canned food on the shelf of the kitchen. We have to learn how to catch the fish at the sea before the canned food all over the kitchen is over. Because we have limited time, we now have less number of canned food at the kitchen. So what we have to do is to learn how to catch the fish immediately, and we have to know how to put that energy in the refrigerator. So we have to know about how to store the wind power as well. So I believe we have to speed up the process of technology development. Martin, what would you say on this?
You mean regarding the question on the falling oil prices or the
or gas prices?
Or gas prices. I think one thing not to be underestimated is how helpful this can be, given that it's reaching global media and that it's a topic that is not only discussed in the departments of energy or within NGOs, but this is something that reaches the common public. And the reflex that many people have is, okay, the gas prices are falling down. This means that many of the structures we have in place are not sustainable, that the companies cannot keep working or having the profits that they were used to before. So what is the alternative? And even though it's hard to sometimes see the direct correlation, be it with wind technology or solar, etc. Most of the time there is no direct correlation. It's nevertheless, when looking from the work that we are doing, a very helpful narrative that suddenly raises the question, what is the alternative out there? And is still cost competitive or not. So I do believe that indirectly it's helping the cause. Yeah.
Okay. Peki.
Okay, then. Let me ask also the questions now. I told you also, what do you think the wind power industry will be after 50 years? But we will have the presentations. Think about the answer to this question. Let's deliver the presentations. First, Steve, you can start with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. Hopefully will answer your questions in the course of the presentation in terms of what we're looking for going forward. Yeah, just briefly, for those of you who don't know us, the Global Wind Energy Council is a trade association representing both the major companies in the sector, but also the major national and regional wind energy associations, including one of our newest members, which is TUREB. I was going to talk about the detailed 2014 market results, look at our short-term projections, then the longer-term projections out to 2030 and 2050, some of the new markets that we're focusing on, and then some conclusions. And I was told to do about 15 minutes. Is that right, Mr. Chairman?
As short as possible. Let's make it interactive.
Okay. All right. Then I'll go very quickly through a lot of numbers. The annual statistics for last year in cumulative terms, we're now up to about 370 gigawatts with 16% growth last year, which is very good compared to the last couple of years, but lower than the long-term average. In terms of the annual market, that's where you see the big difference with 44% growth in 2014, mostly on the strength of the astonishing 23 gigawatts installed in a single year in China last year, with a cumulative annual market up to over 50 gigawatts. In terms of the top 10 globally, we have China, followed by the US and Germany at that top 10, and note with some satisfaction my prediction that Brazil would enter the top 10 in 2014 has in fact come true, and we expect it to rise up very quickly. In terms of the annual market, again, two big surprises, or not surprises, but two big changes. One, of course, is China breaking 20 gigawatts installed in a single year for the first time, and Brazil up in 4th place, which is much higher than it's ever been in any of the other traditional market countries. If you look at the regional distribution of the growth over the last 7 years, you can see that Asia, for the last 5 years, has really dominated. It continues to, and is likely to for the foreseeable future. Offshore, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. There's the rather uneven distribution of the global offshore markets, with the UK with more than the rest of the world combined. That will probably change over the course of the next couple of years as the offshore segments take off, both in Germany and in China. Again, I'm not going to go through the details, but yeah. Okay, here's our short-term projections, which we're releasing at a press conference at 4:30 this afternoon, and then there will be a detailed exposition of the new report for everybody who would like to hear more detail at 5:30 in the Opal room. But basically, after a very large jump in installations in 2014, basically because of the bad year in 2013 with the depressed US market, which Polo talked about in the first session, something of a recovery in the US market, but mostly led by China. And most of the growth that we see is, in fact, outside of the OECD. I mean, non-OECD markets installed more than OECD markets in 2014, and every year for the last 5 years, except for 2012, when the US had an extraordinary year. And we see that trend continuing to go forward and accelerate. With basically having passed the 50 gigawatt threshold, we expect to maintain that level of growth for the next 2 years, cross 60 gigawatts in 2018, and end up the end of this 5-year projection period with a total of about 666 gigawatts rather, installed globally. And the regional distribution of that, again, the big red bar is Asia. Europe will maintain steady, the US will, and North America will be up and down. Latin America begins to make much more of a difference in the overall picture towards the end of that period, as does Africa, which is the purple bar, which is sticking up on the right, the Middle East and Africa. In terms of the longer term projections, this is the Global Wind Energy Outlook that we publish every 2 years, looking at the markets out to 2020, 2030, and ultimately to 2050. To answer the second half of your question, Mr. Chairman, I won't go into the details, but basically we run 3 scenarios, one based on the IEA's new policy scenario, then a moderate scenario, and then an advanced scenario. And the industry has been on the track of this advanced scenario for most of the last decade, flattened out over the last 4 years with the economic crisis, but with the installations last year is back on the advanced scenario. Just to compare this to the presentations you saw in the first session from Paulo, the difference between the IEA 2-degree scenario and our moderate scenario is actually now quite small. But these are the installation numbers going forward. 700 gigawatts in 2020 in the moderate scenario, which is very much in line with what our short-term projections are looking at, a little bit higher than the IEA numbers, with just over 800 in the advanced scenario, and getting up to close to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 gigawatts by 2030, and then somewhere between 2.6 and 4 gigawatts by 2050, 4 terawatts by 2050. In terms of percentage of the penetration of global electricity supply, in the moderate scenario, we're looking at 7 to 8% of global electricity by 2020. In the moderate scenario, 8 to 9%. Again, we run this against 2 different projections of demand growth, one based on the IEA scenario, new policy scenario, and the others on a more energy efficient one. And then by 2030, the number is somewhere between 17 and 19% of global electricity supply in the advanced scenario, between 13 and 15% in the moderate scenario. Again, the variation depending on your projections of demand growth. A topical subject this year, of course, is the emissions associated with the power sector. It is the single largest contributor, about 40% of overall CO2 emissions and 25% of overall greenhouse gas emissions. And if we want to make a big difference in the power sector emissions in the period between now and 2020, when all the scientists tell us that emissions need to peak and begin to decline, if we're to have any chance of meeting the 2-degree target, then there's not many ways that we can make changes. Efficiency being the biggest, easiest, and cheapest, but on the supply side, wind and hydro will supply the majority of any transformation in that time. And yeah, the different scenarios and the consequent CO2 emissions, both in terms of annual and cumulative, are here, and we could be contributing more than 1 billion, well, almost 2 billion tons per year of emissions reductions by 2020 in the advanced scenario. New markets, the big 3 that we have focused on for quite some year now, which will dominate the growth in percentage terms over the rest of this decade, are certainly Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa. Elsewhere in Africa, of course, we have Egypt, the market returning. Morocco just installed Africa's largest wind farm last year, the 300 megawatt Tarfia plant, and new markets in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and I also should add Ghana, Mauritius, and Senegal to that list. In Latin America, again, Brazil will continue to dominate, but we had a very strong market in Chile last year, and of course in Uruguay in percentage terms. Uruguay is very soon going to surpass Denmark as the country with the leading penetration of wind energy. And then in Asia, there are many other markets which, besides China and India, which are important for the future of the industry. So just to wrap up, 2014 will be a good year, and it was a good year, and 2015 is very likely to be another. China, we expect the market to maintain its size roughly within 2 or 3 gigawatts either way, because their feed-in tariff legislation is changing, has changed, but will come into effect in the 1st of January in 2016. So there will be a rush to install at the old price, and their offshore segment is picking up. India has been making a lot of noise and is actually getting very active in terms of developing the renewables market with the new government there. We haven't seen any effect of that yet on the 2014 numbers, but we certainly expect to in 2015. 2014, as you saw from Paolo's presentation in the first section, in the US, we expect to be better than, it was better than 2013, and 2015 will be even better. 2016, I don't know. Some people say that there is enough of a holdover from the last extension of the PTC in the US to give a strong market in 2016 as well, but we don't really know. And after that, it's a complete mystery. So it's very difficult. Europe will remain strong with an unfortunate concentration in just a few markets, but Germany is now supplying close to 50% of the total installations in Europe last year. We expect that to continue, both in terms of the taking off of the offshore segment and a significant quantity of repowering. It would be good to have other strong European markets other than Germany and the UK on the offshore side, but certainly Turkey is one of those. At least in our calculations, Turkey is part of Europe. I know for the EU it's a bit more difficult. Poland is the other one, which is actually a surprisingly strong market. In Latin America, Brazil and will be leading by far. Mexico, technically in IEA terms and in energy measurements, since they joined the OECD, they're now considered part of North America. I still think of them as Latin America, at least culturally. And Mexico is the #2 market in that part of the world, and will be trying to play catch up with Brazil to meet their government's very aggressive targets, both on terms of renewable energy penetration, but also in terms of their recently announced climate change policies. And finally, Africa, I think, will be the big growth story of the next decade. It's starting now. We see these markets taking off. We see these economies growing at 7, 8, 9% per year, granted starting from a very small base, but they also have a very low rate of electrification in most of these countries, which the government is trying to address. And I think it's become a favorite spot for future investment, not only for China, not only for European developers, but from countries all over the world. And I'm not going to go into the offshore discussion since it's not yet an issue here, although as somebody pointed out yesterday, you have borders on 3 oceans, and it may become, or 3 seas anyway, and it may become an issue going forward. But for the whole, I think we can say that all the market drivers that got us to where we are today are still very much in place and will only accelerate as time goes forward, whether that be the increasing cost competitiveness, energy security issues, cost stability, insulation of the economy from the international commodity markets, certainly local economic developments and jobs, and increasingly over time, local air pollution issues as well as climate change. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your promptness. Peki, Ömer Bey.
So, what would you say, Ömer Özgür? You know, you're just a person that implemented several wind power projects in Turkey. What would you say about the wind power industry of Turkey among the global energy trends? We'd be more than happy to listen to you. Thank you very much, distinguished professor. Now, actually, thanks to the efforts of my colleagues, also for this Congress, actually we prepared a presentation, but of course, after listening to Steve's presentation, I thought to myself that there is no need actually to have my presentation, because I think just one sentence would be adequate to discuss about the session, but at the same time we can discuss until the morning. You can actually disseminate the presentation if you wish. I would prefer to speak from the chair rather than delivering the presentation. Now, the wind energy. Now, it is mainly about the control. I mean, it's after the control of the supply and demand of the fossil fuels that we start to discuss about the wind power. There's an increase in the population worldwide, and of course an increase in the energy demand as well worldwide. And therefore, people start to seek for new alternatives. So the first answer was wind and solar. But of course, the revolution, the actual revolution in energy, now should be transferred into technology. You know, with regards to energy generation technologies, we have reached to an efficiency level, and it is at maximum now. Therefore, for generation, for example, Siemens, for example, for the wind turbines produced by GE, now we have over 63% of efficiency, and these are the first discovered ones. The efficiency was around 30-35%. But now the wind turbines, now we have the fourth generation of the wind turbines, and there are very important developments. Just put aside, even for example, the Renaissance in this, what is living the Stone Age is a transmission system, in my opinion. From the very discovery of the electricity can only be transmitted through cable. There is no other way to transmit electricity. Therefore, in electricity transmission system, we are still at the Stone Age. And for example, we have good technology in the generation of power, but it is not reflected into the transmission. And I think this is the reason why, especially, it is not so possible to actually have a business in between supply and demand. We experienced this actually yesterday. As you all know, for example, powers, thanks to the mechanisms that they control, they also provide us with some challenges, commercially and politically. And in the side such a structure, if we fail to have democratization for the transmission system, what I mean is just like the wireless system. I mean, because you have to turn transmission, to electricity transmission, into something that you can get from the air anytime that you want. Wind is a raw material that you cannot control. Therefore, this is the most democratic way of generating energy. What is close to this is the solar. However, natural gas, oil, considering these fossil fuels or coal, when you use those energy resources to generate electricity, this is not democratic. Whoever is controlling the raw material is also controlling the energy. And looking at the energy demand of Turkey, a majority of this is actually imported. And therefore, this is actually a barrier towards democratization. Maybe it may look like so, but this is not the case in my opinion. Why? Because Turkey is located at the hub of this energy traffic. And therefore we have a strength out of this. And in the course of time, maybe in the past we had some difficulty in expressing ourselves, but now we can freely express that we are now controlling this traffic. You can accept this or not. Just check the natural gas map that I showed you. These are the pipelines crossing over Turkey, transiting over Turkey. As you can see, the fluid substances are not just like electricity. It is possible to have a one-way flow. However, in electricity, as you all know, there is actually a two-way transmission system. I mean, over the cable, it is possible to have electricity flow in both directions. Therefore, it is either natural gas or at the same time oil. Transport of oil and natural gas is not something similar to electricity transmission. For example, for my country, if we are speaking about a wind power capacity, for example, especially in the last 10 years, just because we have better regulations, that's why we have a better wind power industry. With regards to the legislative process, for example, my colleagues prepared what we have done in Turkey, bullet by bullet. I'm not just going to go through all these bullets one by one, but what I would like to focus is that, all these boxes, but in all workshops, because of the legislative process, there are several problems that arise. I'm sure, Erol, you suffered a lot in the past due to the legislation, but the important thing to mention in here is that each and every box in here, each and every step in this legislative process, if we are able to put these boxes on the slide, it means that they're all defined. There are no uncertainties. You know the paths that you should follow through these boxes. But the challenges, the difficulties inside each and every box should be corrected maybe. So as not to take too much of your time, what I would like to say is that the wind energy is no more actually an intact area, both in terms of legislation and technology. We have done a lot in Turkey about wind power. Even this event on its own is a proof indication of this. From the political perspective, maybe there is a structure that does not allow us to be in the EU. However, they let us in the EU from the perspective of the energy. There are too many NGOs and several electricity generators that are actually participating in these types of events. So I can say we've joined Europe from the perspective of energy, I would say. So we're just doing good policies. We're at a good location in terms of wind power in Turkey. And as I told you, the life cycle for fossil fuels is 56 years. It should be somehow replaced. But the main problem is transmission. Once again, that's what I can say. Thank you. Actually, what is specific about Özgür is that the first time that I told him about this panel is that the wind does not require any passport. And yesterday I used the same thing. There's no need for passport for wind to travel. But of course, it has some difficulties in terms of electricity transmission. What I learned is that the person who controls the resource will control the energy. I have another question in my mind, actually. Maybe I also would like to ask that question. I will repeat it again later. The question is, yesterday, last year, the International Energy Agency, they are delivering a presentation each and every year. And in the last year's presentation, they were projecting 150 to 200 US dollars for oil, but now it is $50. And so I would like to have the devil's advocate now. So especially in the upcoming days, I know there's a growth potential for wind, I know, but what do you think might went wrong in the wind power industry in future? So what can go wrong in the wind power industry in the near future? Just think about it, because the estimates for the oil price last year, Shell, BP, all analysts, they said 150 to 200 US dollars, but it decreased down to 50. Do you think something similar might also happen in the wind power industries? I don't know, maybe something could go wrong, just like that happened in 2013. So keep this question in your mind. So, Erol, by the way, with regards to presentations, I'm sure by way of the internet and the email, I'm sure you can share your presentations also with the participants. Yes, Erol, let's give the floor to you. Thank you very much, distinguished moderator. It was in 1996 that I first started to work with the wind power. Let me tell you about the milestones, and then in the past, and then I'll speak about future projections. So in 1996, we first started with the wind power in Turkey, and naturally the installed capacity in Turkey, it was 0% of the entire total installed capacity. So I took as a reference the worldwide installed capacity. In 1996, it was 10% of the total installed capacity in Turkey. In 2004, the wind power actually installed capacity in the world catch up with the total installed capacity in Turkey, although we did a lot. Another milestone was in 2009. In Turkey, the wind power generation reached up to 2%, and then at least we actually had a 2% of allocation from the electricity bill. So in 10 years time, only actually we actually have reached to an allocation for this. So we're doing good thanks to the allocations. But nowadays I can say the wind power is around 3.5% in Turkey. This year, another milestone for the world, the installed, again, the capacity of wind power reached to the nuclear power. around 370, not in generation of course, but in installed capacity. Probably by 2020 also the generation will be, I guess, I mean the electricity generated from wind will be over the electricity generated through the nuclear power plants. So in Turkey, for 2023, we actually have the target of 20,000 megawatts. Whether it is realistic or not, let me just make you a comparison. Let's compare to Germany because we have close ties to Germany. If we say we need a land, a space for wind, the surface area of Turkey is 2 times larger than Germany. However, in Germany, they have 39,000 megawatts. It's only 4,000 in Turkey. So we are lagging quite behind. Population. We're doing much better, almost the same population with Germany, but Germany is again ahead of us in terms of population. In terms of GDP, 1 to 4.5, that is the ratio. In terms of electricity consumption, the ratio is 1 to 3. And it is mainly because of energy efficiency issues in Turkey. Germany actually consumes 3-fold more, but however, the GDP ratio is actually 4.5. So, Germany, the installed capacity is 39 gigawatts, probably making a projection for 23, and at the same time, if you make a proportion to 1 to 3 of the electricity consumption, we require 23 gigawatts in Turkey. If we adjust it to GDP, then 15 gigawatts. So 20,000 megawatts is not something like a dream. We should work hard, of course. The Turkish investors are really hard working on this, but licensing issues is actually problematic. I mean, we have a certain path to go, but we're just tired from our legs. I mean, we have to just take small steps. Rather than taking small steps on the long journey, I guess we have to cut those ties and leap forward towards the target that we set. And Turkey does not have any fossil fuels, so it is an indication that we should do something about it, and which I believe we will succeed in doing so. Martin?
I will take you briefly through my presentation, and I will keep it brief, Mr. Chairman. Yes, good morning. Pleasure to be here today in Turkey. My name is Martin Hallen from REN21, the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st century. I mean, the long name basically already explains who we are. We are a multi-stakeholder network of different actors, governments, international organizations, and industry associations that basically work all together on the main goal of pushing the transition towards renewables forward. Today I will quickly give you an overview of the global developments that took place not only in the last 10 years, but especially based on the cutoff date 2013, when our last main report came out, so that as timely information as possible for all other technologies. Some of the information that Steve Sawyer and also Paolo Frankel doing his great presentation this morning have mentioned are a bit more up to date, but for the other points I think it will provide a good context for the additional discussion. So as mentioned, we are a multi-stakeholder network based in Paris. We are hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme, and the main aim of our entity is to have basically everybody on board, all the technologies, governments, the coalition of the willing, as we call them, because we really want to underline that the issue of putting new capacities into place, be it in wind power, be it in solar, is something that can only be tackled from a broader coalition. And it can be counterproductive to move straight forward just with one initiative in mind. We try to fulfill our mandate by providing high quality information. I mean, we are most famous for our global status report that I've just mentioned. So this is a publication that comes out once a year. and is amongst the most cited reports out there on renewable energy. We benefit a lot from the data that is being provided by our contributors network, not only the industry associations, but also informal information in regions that do not have the capacity sometimes or the methodologies to provide information to give us visibility. Another quick thing before I go to the next one is that we are also the facilitators for the International Renewable Energy Conferences that are taking place every 2 years, and as mentioned this morning, the next one will take place in October in Cape Town in South Africa, and also very symbolically the first one that takes place in Africa. So you can already see that there's a paradigm shift happening in the renewable energy world. So the evolution of renewable energy over the past decade has surpassed all expectations. I think many in the room here can agree. It saw a steady increase in the global demand for renewable energy, while overall primary energy supply from renewables in 2004 was 57 exajoules. By 2013, total supply has grown to 76 exajoules. So the global capacity and production from all renewable energies have increased substantially. But we must also not forget that the state of renewables is totally different than it was a decade ago. Developments in the early 2000s showed upward trends in global energy investment, capacity and integration across all sectors, yet most mainstream projections did not predict the extraordinary expansion of renewables that was to be unfolding. A decade ago, modern renewable energy was also a topic mainly in the OECD countries, and over the course of the last decade, renewables deployment has reached all continents. However, it is characterized by different speeds and also stimulated by various other drivers. In absolute figures, and now I touch directly on what my Turkish colleagues have mentioned, what you can see here are, as we call them, the champions. I mean, in absolute figures, we have the usual suspects like China, the US, Japan, that were the top investors in renewable energy. But once you put this into perspective per GDP, and we did this based on 2012 in US dollar numbers, is you get a totally different list. I mean, we have Uruguay on board, already heard this, Mauritius, Costa Rica, South Africa, and this clearly highlights the rapid advancement of renewable energy, especially in developing and already developed countries. Renewables power capacity, excluding hydropower, saw a 7-fold increase during the past decade, so from 85 gigawatt up to 560 gigawatt in 2013, and based on the numbers that we heard from Steve before, it will be much higher based on 2014. The cost for most technologies has decreased significantly, and supporting policies have continued to spread throughout the world, not only within the OECD context. This slide, I mean, you have partly seen it for wind power already. Today, renewable energy comprises of 26.4% of global power generation capacity globally, and 22.1% of global electricity was produced from renewable energy, which includes hydropower in this case. Variable renewables are achieving high levels of penetration in several countries, and the example of Denmark and Spain plays a role, but we also heard that Portugal, as a new contender, since the beginning of 2014, represents up to 63% of consumption in the mainland by October. Quick, word to wind power capacity. Again, those numbers are not the most up-to-date ones, so I'm speaking to the experts here. But by the end of 2013, cumulative global wind capacity was 318 gigawatts, and this was an increase of over 270 gigawatts since 2004. So those are unbelievable numbers when you speak them out loud. Total cumulative installations stand today, based on the latest GWEC information, by around 370 gigawatts. One thing that needs also great attention when talking about this topic in context of policymakers is the heat from modern biomass, solar and geothermal. Accounts for a small but gradually rising share of final global heat demand, and amounts right now to an estimate of 10%. The use of modern renewable technologies for heating and cooling are still limited relative to their vast potential, and as mentioned, greater attention is necessary. When looking at transport, liquid biofuels met around 2.3% of total transport fuel demand, but also here there are increasing initiatives where people try to link electric transport systems with renewable energy, particularly at the city and regional levels, which also shows here once more that not only from the national level policies are being put in place that are effective, but especially when digging a bit deeper on the regional level. Global investment in renewable energy between 2004 and 2013 amounted to 1.6 trillion US dollars, and only last year, those are the latest figures from the global tracking framework that we are supporting technically, are that there was a 279 billion US dollar investment in 2014. So this is a 17% increase. So again, very big numbers. Here also already kind of duplicating of what Paolo has indicated this morning, there's a paradigm shift globally. I mean, you see the fluctuation on the side of the US, which is directly connected to the policy instability and the tax incentives that are not always clear, but you can also see that the growth that took place in Europe throughout the beginning of the decade has been delayed slightly, and that the new contenders from South Asia, East Asia, but also from Latin and South America, and especially Africa, catching up. Renewable energy jobs doubled in the past decades. Right now they're estimated to be 6.5 million jobs in the renewable energy sector worldwide. Vast amount of this stems from China. One thing that is also worth mentioning here, that next to jobs in the support and also the maintenance of installations, more and more interesting initiatives are popping up in the ICT sector to actually now benefit from the newly available power sources that are in place and to use them more effectively. Maybe one quick word before I come to the last slides on the policy landscape, where you can see the direct correlation to also the successes that I've just depicted, is that back in 2005 we had only 15 countries that had policies in place, and if we compare this to 2013, we had a vast 144 countries with renewable energy targets and at least 138 countries with renewable energy policies. One table that is not visible here, but it's also very interesting, is that you have lots of policies that have been picked up in the OECD countries in the first part of the decade, and we then did a spread geographically to see what was happening in the second half, and especially in developing countries, very interesting initiatives and approaches have been developed that are now also being used as inspiration for new initiatives on the OECD side. We have talked about the change in perception, we have talked about the different scenarios that emerge, and before repeating what has been mentioned before, I just want to let you know that historic projections can fall short, and this is something that has happened in the past and that can also happen today. Back in 1997, the World Bank has predicted 6 gigawatts of wind in China for 2020, and we all know that this was vastly surpassed. So by 10 years later, there was 10 times this amount reached, and with close to 60 gigawatts of capacity installed there. And last but not least, the conclusion that I want to make is that the global perception has shifted considerably. Today, renewables have arrived in the mainstream and are the preferred energy source of the general public in many parts of the world, but there's still plenty of ground to cover. For the last 40 years, wherever the world economy grew, so did the Earth's carbon dioxide levels, until last year. And the International Energy Agency recently reported that in 2014, the economy grew and CO2 levels didn't, which is a first. The shift is due to China's increased use of renewable energy resources and efforts by big countries in the OECD to promote sustainable forms of energy. This development is particularly encouraging in view of the upcoming COP21 in Paris, and we also try to be the voice of renewables and there locally. And the global energy transition with renewables is ongoing. Close collaboration with all actors from the public and the private sector is needed to bring it to the next level. And with this, I thank you.
Şimdi
Now, we'll make another round, but I have a question to the audience. Erol Demirer stated that 20,000 megawatt is reasonable and realistic, he said, for 2023 target. Is a target that we can achieve. He also provided an example with Germany. So, in 2023, who are the people that believe that the target is achievable? Would you please raise your hands? Those who believe, those who doesn't believe. We have more non-believers than the believers. What is the case? I'll ask you later for that. Now, to Erol and Özgür, I will ask them how we are going to reach to these goals. You see, people are not convinced. We have the representatives of the industry. I will ask you that question. And then I have two more questions on the top of this. The first one is I already asked you, what can go wrong in the wind power industry? Because really, I mean, for example, the oil industry, for example, shocked about this. They were not prepared. The second thing is that Özgül actually answered this somehow, but after 20, 30 years from now on, where do you think our sector will be? I'm not asking only about expansion. In terms of technological developments, what are your dreams for 20, 30 years ahead? Especially these two questions are for our foreign guests, and I will have a third question. And Erol already discussed the investment duration is too long in the wind power. I'm wondering whether the international organizations are doing something about this. I mean, in terms of the investment duration, investment periods in particular. For example, work permits, licensing, and about all these things.
Information about this, we would be very happy that you share with us. Eğer yoksa böyle bir çalışmanız,
if you do not have anything like this, maybe for the next meeting you should be prepared for this. Especially, I mean, the international organizations, I guess, should do something about this. What is being done? Let's start from the order. Please also answer these questions, if it is okay.
Yeah, what could go wrong? Well, I hesitate to mention because, you know, it might jinx it. But I think the main thing that can go wrong and the biggest risk associated with wind power development these days is policy uncertainty. I mean, we saw the consequences in Paolo's presentation this morning very, very graphically about the consequences for the industry in the United States because of the US Congress messing about and pursuing a very short-term policy. And it not only has an impact on installations, it has an impact on employment, and most importantly on local industry. I mean, ironically, because of the relatively liberal trade rules in the US, up until 5 years ago, you would only have about 40 to 45% local content in your wind project in the United States. Then, as the policy was more solid at the end of the previous decade, that number got up to almost 70, 75%. As soon as we reached the policy cliff in 2012, it went right back down again, as did employment, from 80 or 90,000 down to about 40,000 in the space of 1 year. Now it's climbed back up again. But that's no way to build a successful industry. And the US is one very large example, but if we had a problem in China or in Brazil or whatever, that could certainly screw up our projections. And the second thing that concerns me is a growing, well, there's two tendencies. One, to create a global supply chain, a liberalized market, to maximize the effect of the global supply chain on lowering costs. And that is a trend which is continuing, but at the same time we see an increasing or a new round of protectionism. Countries setting local content rules, countries setting import barriers. I mean, it's not black and white. We know that you're using the local content rule here in Turkey as well to add to the feed-in tariff, and we'll judge in a few years as to whether or not that was a successful policy. But that could be a problem. And then, of course, if somebody discovers how to make fusion power, then we'll all be out of business, but that won't necessarily be a bad thing.
Özgür, hem bu
So this 20,000 megawatt, I mean, answer this question and at the same time about Turkey's target. 20,000 megawatt. I sincerely believe that we will reach this goal. From the very beginning of the 2000, as Errol stated, it was just 19 megawatt of the installed capacity, but now it is 4,000 megawatts, just in a decade or more. And I believe that if we continue with the same speed, yes, we can reach to 20 gigawatt. But in making the analysis and assessment, I think we also should not do the assessment just according to the political conjuncture. We have to consider just like a technocrat. I'm not, for example, I'm a fan of Galatasaray, but I'm not saying that I hate all Beşiktaş people. So what I'm saying is that the main issue about the energy industry is globalization, in my opinion. Why is that? Because if we somehow figure out about the globalization issue as all the stakeholders, I'm sure that we will have, if we have a more equal share in the energy industry, everything would be much better. Because in the power industry, the product itself is electricity, and you cannot store electricity. When you generate a product that you cannot store, then you have to use it, you have to consume it. And if we can evenly distribute this all around the world, there will be no problem. The technology providers, the G8 countries, for example, and those who are using the most, G20 countries, and those who are at the who need it the most, the underdeveloped countries. If this globalization in energy is distributed evenly, everything would be fine. We need an even and a fair distribution. I'll share an anecdote with you. In the United States, after World War II, they established an air base, a space base in Arizona, and it was actually a simulation of the moon, actual simulation of the moon, and they started to work there. And then the local people there, and again old Indian there, just watching from outside what's going on there. And then when the Americans went to the moon, they said, let's give a message from each and every language in the world. And the American Indian, they wanted to get the message from that Indian, the old Indian as well, and then they record the message. And then after many long years, after the preparations were over, it was the time to go to the moon, and they started to check once again the messages from the world. And then they wanted to check the message from that old Indian, and via a translator, they listened to the message. It says, be careful, they are coming to the moon to take your territories away from you, and be careful. So, I mean, the globalization with this thinking in mind is not something correct. I mean, the foreign investors coming in here, if they come here with a view to exploit or abuse the people here, this is wrong. But if they are coming here for technology, then they are very well welcomed. And when we will never, and we should not consider them as the people with the money. I mean, we also should not abuse their capital or exploit their capital. What we should do is, the globalization in energy, I believe it should be more humane. Not, I mean, if we design it in a good way, I know I'm just talking like a philosopher, not an engineer, I know it, but this is the only way that we can figure this out, in my opinion. As an answer to your second question, very quickly, now, about the problems in the administrative process in Turkey, it's a relative issue, in my opinion. It is long according to what? I went to China, I'm 165 and I just feel like a giant. I mean, it's relativity. In Germany, for example, I closely watched the construction of a hydroelectricity power plant. It took 18 years for the completion of all administrative procedures in Germany. I mean, it's all about relativity. I mean, if you handle the things in a shorter period of time that you imagine, you cannot say it's long. Of course, you have to identify the challenges due to the nature of the job. Errol stated about the licensing process. He said it is long and it's very gradual and step by step. If you're asking, it's a definition problem. Once we make a good description and definition, and then you can take your position accordingly. That's the reason why, if you're asking me, the licensing process is not too long. Rather than complaining it, I think what we have to do is actually to design the processes. And this is what we should do. Thank you. Actually, GVAC should maybe have a study. I mean, if they make a study and compare the processes in each and every country about the licensing, for example, about the startup, it would be nice to have a comparative study. I mean, GVAC can do this, and they can compare each and every country depending on licensing and everything, so we can understand our position. Errol, what would you say? Majority of the audience is not convinced about the 20 gigawatt. I believe we can do it, but with this speed, probably not. Right, but it's a very political answer, I should say. I mean, we can attain, it's an achievable goal, but we actually should do something. In terms of the licenses and all, as Özgür said, it is correct. I mean, because if you don't know the route, the path to follow, then you cannot have a shortcut. I mean, it will take longer. For example, once I have a wind power plant, I follow another procedure. In the next one, another procedure. I think simplification could be good. The assessment process can be shortened. We can have more specialized people in the assessment team. And also, once you deal with one license rather than 30 megawatts, for example, we can have 100 megawatts for one project. So, because you're dealing with all the issues of allowances. You also asked 2050, right? An experienced colleague of mine said, if you do not want to be mistaken about your estimations, make an estimate as long as you cannot live through. So 2050 is quite a good year for me. I probably not survive to 2050. Even if I do, I'll be too old. So no, I will not have to be accountable for anyone. 2100 would be much easier. Will be 100% renewable in 2100. But for 2050, that's what the scenarios are saying, 70 to 80% renewable. And probably we'll expect a new technology to come, and of course it should be deployed all around the world. There will be the need for advanced storage facilities. Of course, wind is barely competing with the conventional energy resources. We don't have money to spend for storage facilities, but I'm sure that in the course of time we also will start thinking about the storage facilities. We will have budget to allocate for this. Of course, the technology will also improve more. So, in the long run, renewable energy, I mean, because the fossil fuels will end. Martin?
Yes, I mean, also the question what can go wrong with the wind power industry in the coming years and decades. I mean, I'm not in the position to give explicit indications, but what I can say in general is that we have to realize that not only the wind technology but also other renewable technologies have matured. We have in several regions already very mature markets and are price competitive. But one thing that still needs to mature in order to also play in this game are capabilities also in order to make those things a reality by convincing decision makers to put those into place. And I think when looking at the industries, not the wind power industry in general, I think here it's very progressed, but when looking at all technologies, one thing that sometimes still is being mentioned within is that, oh, how great, we have progressed so much, and we look at the decade, look at my presentation, it sounds all too good to be true, but the reality is we are not alone on this field. Yeah? I mean, we have other very established players that have decades of experience, not only in lobbying, but also shaping the minds of decision makers. And this is not to be underestimated. One might call this separation pain. of the established fossil fuel industry, and we can tell ourselves the rational choice is renewables or is wind power. But we have to also keep in mind that the next 10 years can be very crucial in shaping a long-term kind of pathway. And I think here all industries still have lots of things to consider and then building capacity there.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you very much. Now, if there is any question from the audience, very burning questions if you have only. I mean, if you're saying I have to ask that question. I mean, we can get the questions if you want. Hello, I have a question. Introduce yourself. Sure. Gözde Kuşgöz. I'm from Izmir Economy University. I'm having my master's degree. And about shale gas, I have a question actually, and the effect of shale gas and oil to wind. Because for fossil fuels, 50 to 60 years of life expectancy that we have. But for the shale gas and oil, what would you say? I mean, of course, depending on the consumption. But International Energy Agency report is also showing that for the newly discovered non-conventional methods, especially shale gas and oil, what kind of an effect it will have on wind power? Thank you. Yes, please.
Well, as we saw from the robust markets for both wind and solar in the United States last year, not much. And the biggest ever year for wind power in the US was 2012, which was probably at the height of the shale gas boom and at the low end of the costs. I think there's two things we need to know about shale gas. One is that the cost of production of shale gas is higher than the market price in the United States now. It has been for some time. It has always been, actually, since this whole shale gas boom. And the way the companies pay for it is because they produce in two ways. One is they produce large quantities of natural gas liquids at the same time as they produce the shale gas, which they sell for $100. Well, they used to sell for $100 a barrel as crude. Now they can only sell as $60 a barrel. And the second thing is that for the rest of the shale gas is produced as a byproduct of the tight oil, so-called tight oil. So as a standalone proposition, shale gas loses money. Today, last year, the year before, and at the prices that prevail in the United States now. As Paolo mentioned in his presentation, the shale gas prices are moving up, and if they were to reflect the true cost of production, would be of a similar nature as other major gas markets in the world. So, but even at the artificially low natural gas prices that are in the US today, wind is competing very successfully. So again, and that's not to mention the trillions and trillions of liters of fresh water that's wasted in association with shale gas production, the energy that's involved in collecting and pumping that, the chemicals that are pumped underground, the leakage from the methane and the CO2 from burning the stuff. So I think we're in a pretty strong position there. I mean, I should mention that the prices in the central part of the US for wind energy now are the lowest in the world by far, where what the utilities are paying is somewhere on the around 2 to 2.5 US cents per kilowatt hour. If you add the PTC onto that, you get prices up closer to 35 or 40, or 3.5 to 4 cents. But even new build shale gas plant, new build gas plant using shale oil can't match those prices. There's been an awful lot of talk about developing shale gas in other parts of the world, but nobody's yet done it to any scale. I think partly because they encounter the problems that are masked by the complicated situation in the US, and once they do, not to mention the environmental and other concerns. I know I live in Holland, and there was a huge debate over, and Holland is still one of the few gas exporting countries left in Northern Europe. And we're very interested in exploiting the shale gas, but basically local environmental considerations have prevented that so far, and I don't think it's going to go ahead. Plus the costs will be very high, and as the spot market price in European gas market comes down, it's just not economical.
Başka?
Any further question from the audience?
Peki ben demin ilavede 20 bin megawatt hedefine ben baktım 20 bin megawatt.
I'm just stick to that, but that 20 gigawatt. Someone who raised the hand saying that it's not an achievable goal. Can someone tell me why it's not possible to achieve the 20,000 megawatt target?
Siz ne yapıyorsunuz?
You are a non-believer. Yeah, I'm a non-believer. Why? Let's look at the realizations. The target is superb. 20 gigawatt. If we succeed in doing this, it means we will have a saving of $6 billion of saving from the natural gas. But the actual realization, for example, since the publication of the law, it is just 3,700 megawatts. It's okay, there is an increase in the trend recently, but over the years it is also 550 to 60 megawatts of a capacity increase that we put on the top of it. So do the math until 2023. And looking at the projects before 2007, the licenses before 2007, only 63% of the licenses given before 2007 was realized, and everything was more simple at that time, just the measuring requirement, and they actually selected the most windy territories in Turkey. Look at the licenses given in 2011. I think the realization rate is around 10%, not even 20%, 10 to 15% is the realization rate. So we have to talk over the facts and figures so everything is clear. I mean, having 20 gigawatt of a target, is it achievable? I agree with Errol. It is possible, not under these circumstances. We have to do something immediately. Take some measures, I don't know. Maybe we should do something about licenses, simplify it, facilitate it, and because we have actually a regulation, very complicated and changing all the time. And also, we have to do a lot of changes in terms of licensing as well. As you can understand from the figures that I provide you, it's okay, we're just giving too many licenses, but the people who are given the licenses are not actually implementing these projects. So we have to go through it. I mean, I think licenses should be given to the companies that can actually implement the projects. Thank you. Let's do something else now. A foreign guest, for example, of us. Is it possible for you to make a comparison? I mean, any foreign guest, would you like to say anything about the licensing process in your country? The audience, the foreign guests in the audience. Someone can take the floor and tell us, because I understand that the licensing procedure is problematic. In Germany, do we have someone from Germany? For example, my colleague said it took 18 years for hydropower. Anyone from our foreign participants? Maybe I can ask a question. I agree with what the lady said. Maybe there are things that we have to correct. I agree with this, but one sentence that she said, I'm just confused about that sentences. Said only 63% of the licenses were completely fulfilled. I would like to tell you it once again. 63 of them granted licenses were completed. I mean, we have to be positive. We have to. 63% is a good number in my opinion, and I think the problems that should be corrected is mainly about synchronization. Why? Because the license granting authorities are having some lack of coordination issues, the expropriation authority, the Ministry of Forestry, or special military zone, these types of issues. If we just fix the synchronization between the agencies, everything will be fixed. But another thing I would like to underline is that in no country at all, after the we have a huge increase in asset value in Turkey after the licensing. I mean, for example, the asset value of the projects. I mean, let's assume a project with paperwork completed, and the asset value in Turkey is very high because we enjoy paper trade more and paperwork trade more than that. And this is the reason why I think integrating, focusing on the licensing, if you're asking me, is just the reason for that. The actual investors, just like Errol, just like the large-scaled groups, are there so as not to be affected from that licensing process. They also agree that there is the need to fix that synchronization and coordination issue. But this 20 gigawatt target, it is feasible in terms of capital, in terms of technology. We have no challenge at all. Just we have to change our perspective. Thank you.
We have done something of a study on this, or not a comprehensive global one. That would be a very big job, but we'll look at it. But we worked with IRENA and did an assessment of 30 years of wind policy in the 10 biggest markets across the world. It's available on our website. It's available on the IRENA site as well. And one of the things that I think you find as you go across and compare the different markets is that there are, besides the wind resources, there are two major factors that affect the ultimate price that you pay for wind power. And they're related. One is the cost of capital, as Paolo put out this morning in his presentation, and the other is the length and complexity of the planning process. I mean, the starkest example in Europe is the difference in the cost of a kilowatt hour of wind power generated electricity between Germany and UK. It's 30, 40, 50% more expensive in the UK than it is in Germany. And we all know that the UK has much better winds. But the two big factors in the UK which make a difference are the policy uncertainty, which makes the risk premium associated with the capital much higher, and then of course the extreme expense of going through a very, very, very long and tedious planning process. Now they're trying to address that. And the places with the cheapest wind energy are the places where the planning process is very, very quick, which is China and the central part of the United States. I talked about that corridor in the central part of the United States between Texas and the Dakotas, where if you've ever been there, you know it's a bunch of big, empty, open places that's flat. Nobody cares about the environment. There's no birds, there's nothing. You just drive the truck in and pour the concrete and build the plant. And that contributes greatly to the lack of expense. And also, on the Chinese side, if you don't have any private ownership of land and you get a permit from the government to build there, that simplifies things extraordinarily. Now, I'm not advocating either one of those, but I think we see the consequences in the costs associated with wind power development in both of those places. And in Brazil, the planning process is now pretty quick. I don't know what the pre-qualification development time would be. What, maybe 2 years? We have the representatives of the Brazilian Association, they could tell, but they sell and sign contracts to deliver wind power in usually 3 years from the point of being granted the permit and winning the auction bid. Sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's 2 years. So it's relatively short in that case, and that's the other place in the world, one of the other places in the world where you see very low prices for wind. So I think it's something of a paradox here, because you have very competitive prices for wind, but your planning process is very complicated and very long. Think of how much better the prices could be if it were simple and short. Because we obviously need it, because we don't have enough power.
İnşallah başımıza dünkü gelen gibi bir şey gelmez.
Hope it will be just back again soon. So first of all, the one thing that I would like to mention here is that I personally enjoyed the panel and the session a lot. Our foreign guests and also our two, again, local guests, I've learned a lot from them. And I either should be the person teaching something or should be the person learning something, but the best thing is to do the two things at the same time. Thank you very much to all the panelists for your attendance. And before I end the session, we actually have a certificate and would like to present the certificate to each and every panelist. And thank you to the audience as well, and I hope that you also have enjoyed the session just like us, and have a nice day.
My wife says I can't bring any more home. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure.